And now, a word from our sponsor. Ayaya songs are about our histories. Ayaya is an Inuit-owned firm that tells our stories in many languages across Canada. They are experts in publishing children's books, usually in syllabics, and they do large multi-language projects like the reports of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission. If you need help getting your stories into classrooms or homes in Cree, Inuktitut, or other Indigenous languages, check them out at ayaya.ca. That's ayaya.ca. Ayaya is a proud sponsor of the Roots and Hoots podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Roots and Hoots, a podcast project produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation. Since 2020, we have been gathering, laughing, learning hard truths, and sharing in community conversations with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Each episode, we learn something new, and we're excited to be sharing this journey with you. Roots and Hoots is about connecting with and celebrating Indigenous peoples' contributions to their fields of study, work, and cultures. We also speak with allies who share how they are furthering the work of reconciliation in Canada. To learn more about the Legacy of Hope Foundation and the work that we do, please visit legacyofhope.ca.
Welcome back to another episode of Roots and Hoots. In this interview, host Gordon sits down with Mr. Douglas Sinclair. Douglas is a member of the Peguis First Nation and Treaty 1 territory. He is the publisher and founder of Indigenous Watchdog, a vital online resource which reports on the status of truth and reconciliation in this country and holds stakeholders accountable to progress made in real time. For listeners who haven't yet visited the website and are interested in following the status of truth and reconciliation in Canada, we highly encourage you to check out indigenouswatchdog.org. Tune into this episode where Douglas describes some key features of the website and what he sees as standing in the way of furthering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. Please enjoy this special episode of Roots and Hoots.
Douglas Sinclair. We're with Douglas Sinclair today. He's from the Indigenous Watchdog. Douglas, maybe you can just start by telling us a bit about yourself and your background, your Indigenous background, and the community you come from.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for having me. So I'm from actually Peguis First Nation, which is Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. So I've been, my father went to the Fort Alexander Indian Residential School, which is in Seguin, up around Seguin First Nation in Pine Falls. And it was interesting. Yeah. So I was moved to Toronto, and this is probably about 48 years ago. So quite a while. And I have 3 daughters. And it's quite interesting because all 3 of them are quite heavily engaged in Indigenous work and promotion and advocacy, which gives me a lot of satisfaction in doing that as well. And I have 6 brothers all across the country, from everywhere from up in the Paw, Manitoba, living at a reserve up there, to Los Angeles, California, and Ottawa, Edmonton, Calgary, Nanaimo. And now I'm situated in Hamilton.
Put a lot of miles behind you, eh?
I've been around. I've lived pretty well every place in the country, I think.
Yeah. Did you mentioned you mentioned Pine Falls, Sagging First Nation. That's where a residential school was. Did you go there, or was it your father?
No, I never went to Indian residential school, but my father went when he was a young boy, between the ages of 5 and 10, something like that.
Yeah.
And so he was going to, there was a Catholic, Port Alexander.
Yes.
A pretty notorious residential school, and he certainly had a lot of abuse that he endured when he was there, and that certainly shaped who he was as an individual. And in turn, that really shaped, I think, how each of his 7 sons evolved over time. One of my brothers passed away recently, so there's 6 surviving sons. But all of us have, I think, just like with every second, third generation survivor group, carry some of the scars with us as well, in terms of the way that we relate. We can get into a bit more when I talk about Native Child and Family Services as well.
Yeah. How did your 15 years on the board of the Native Child and Family Services of Toronto, how did it shape you, the person you become, and the work that you do?
It was actually quite an interesting evolution in my involvement with the Indigenous world, because up until that point, and I was in my 40s, I had really turned my back on sort of Indigenous. My father was totally into assimilation. As a result of the residential school, he denied his indigeneity, carried a lot of shame about what happened there. And so personally, I mean, I had a lot of, I think I carried some of that residual shame as well. And so didn't really get engaged within the Indigenous community. And growing up in Toronto, I mean, all my family and relatives and cousins and everyone else were all back in Manitoba and in Selkirk, Manitoba, and up in Peguis. So there wasn't a lot of connection with culture. And so my kids never really had exposure to that as well. And it was my wife who, when she was taking a social work degree at Toronto Metropolitan University, did a placement at Native Child and Family Services. And she sort of encouraged me and sort of dragged me kicking and screaming practically to Native Child to sort of volunteer on the board. Yeah, because I was, up until that point, I had really been that engaged. And was resistant to a degree.
Yeah.
But once I got on the board, I mean, I could see that the really good work that they were doing, the connections that they were making to community, how they were really doing whatever they could within the constraints of the child welfare system to be able to implement and deliver programs that would really uplift the Indigenous population in Toronto. I mean, and that came with its challenges as well, because child welfare is I mean, it's a battleground, whether it's run by Indigenous First Nations or whether it's run by the government. There's issues. But I think Native Child at that time, under the leadership of Ken Richard, who was the executive director and he was the founder of Native Child, and he actually now sits on my board of directors. So they did really a lot of solid work. And also they had annual events, and there were different powwows like that other Indigenous organizations would do in Ontario, in Toronto. And so I got to expose my kids to some of the more Indigenous cultural activities, which benefited them tremendously because they got that exposure, which I never had the opportunity to receive myself.
You mentioned that Indigenous Native Child and Family Services, you were involved in that. Are you still involved with that? Are you still on the board?
No, I left the board. I mean, when I left, I was on the board for about 15 years.
Yeah.
The last 3 years, I was the president of the board.
Yeah.
That was when we were negotiating the mandate for child welfare for Indigenous kids with the Ontario government. And so and that was a pretty intense process and lots of meetings and engagement. And when it was finished, I just thought I needed to have a bit of a break. So I sort of retired from the board at that point. And the board it's a 3-year term. So after the term was finished, I decided, and I still kept in touch with them, but I was no longer involved in the day-to-day sort of governance aspects of the organization.
Yeah, and notice that child welfare is one of the 94 calls to action. And we'll get into that in a bit. What is let's talk a little bit about your organization, the Indigenous Watchdog, and how it came to be.
Well, it actually started in April of 2016. I mean, that's when I had retired from my day job, and I had been in technology for 35 years, and decided, because I had been engaged within the Indigenous world prior to that, I wanted to get re-engaged, and was looking at what I could sort of latch my hands onto. And this was about 4 months after the TRC released the final report. And so I was curious about what was happening and if anything. And so around in April, I started tracking and just reading like the papers and just seeing and I kept a sort of a record of what was going on. And probably I did that for about 3 years. And after about 2 years of doing it, I had enough information and I had pretty well organized it. And to me, when I was setting it up, I mean, there were 3 sort of guiding principles that were important. One was that it had to be distinctions-based. So it had to address First Nations and it had to address Métis and Inuit issues because they each have distinct needs and issues that they address. It had to be comprehensive in terms of covering all the stakeholders. So that's all of the federal, provincial, territory, municipal governments, and churches, business, universities, colleges, museums, archives, anyone that had a call to action designated to them. It was important to me that they be tracked as well. So it had to be comprehensive. And then the next thing it had to cover all 22 themes of the call to action, all the calls to action from the TRC. And when I put together those 22 themes, it seemed to me there was about 8 there were some that were missing. I mean, they were covered to some degree by the TRC, but they had no dedicated calls to action, like around drinking water advisories, around food insecurity, around the environment, around housing, around urban commitments to truth and reconciliation. And then overriding it all, I put one in called government commitments. And so when you look at the Indigenous Watchdog, there's a separate section on the top called government commitments. And that's really the high-level macro view of what a government's actually committing to for truth and reconciliation. And then when you get into the calls to action, that's when the rubber hits the road. This is what they're actually doing now when it gets into child welfare, into justice, into health, into UNDRIP and what have you. So those three things were the important guiding principles in getting Indigenous Watchdog to a point where it could build and launch its own website, which I did with a friend of mine. Put up an initial website in 2020, and that was basically using the same guiding principles that I had for the Indigenous Watchdog as an organizational structure, which is basically transposed from written to digital. And that was up for 2 years. And then I got a good grant from Community Foundations Canada. And that really paid for the site that is up now. And basically, we launched this in February of, I think it was 2022, when that site was launched. And that's when I did the first sort of went to a show in Ottawa. And that was sort of the launch of the Indigenous Watchdog. It's been going now for since 5 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the newest website is, in theory, it's been going since 2018 when the first site was sort of built.
Yeah. For our listeners who may not know, what are the categories that make up the 94 calls to action, and what is their current status?
Well, if you look at the way that the TRC structured things, they set up something called legacy calls to action, and these are the first 42. And those 42 are divided into 5 key areas, and that's child welfare, education, language and culture, health, and justice. And so you have 42 calls to action that are specific to those particular areas. And those were the really foundational ones. I mean, those were the ones that would have a direct impact on the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people right now. That's things the government could do to implement policies and programs that would impact directly, as I said, the quality of life across key aspects of people's ability to live and have successful lives in the country. The next, the balance in something called reconciliation calls to action. And these are more societal things that society as a whole could implement, and that includes the churches, includes civil servants and training, includes museums, includes archives, includes the churches, includes UNDRIP. There's a few things like that. So there's another 52 calls to action in the reconciliation side. So those 94 were released initially, actually in June 2015. That's when the summary report came out from the TRC. And then the final report came out in December of 2015. So now here we are. It's over 10 years now since those calls to action were released. And if you listen to the federal government, who are accountable for 76 of those calls to action, and so they have the lion's share of the work to do. And that's primarily because they have legislative responsibility for Indigenous affairs. So of the 76, the government, if you look on their website, they will say that they're 85% complete or well underway, which is really a total distortion. And in my view, it's an outright lie, because that's not the case at all. If you look at Indigenous Watchdog, according to the reporting that I've done, and the reporting that Indigenous Watchdog does is not sort of personal opinion, it's based on facts. And those facts come from the 11 primary sources that Indigenous Watchdog goes to every single day, 365 days a year. And that's things like Nation Talk, Indigenews, Windspeaker, the Tyee, Canada's National Observer, the Narwhal, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the First Peoples Law Report. And so these are credible, independent organizations that are looking at what government is doing across a wide spectrum of different things and publishing articles and research and investigative reports. And so every day, Indigenous Watchdog scans anything that comes from those sources and then sorts them into any one of those 30 themes on the site. In those themes on the site, there's 30 main themes, And they're subdivided themselves into about, I think it's about 800 plus sub-themes right across them all. So, I mean, there's a ton of information. And right now, as of today, there's about 12,000 plus posts on the site. There's over 1,500 that have PDFs. And those are more almost like the solution guidance sort material that can be on the site. And that's everything from white papers to paper, like just research papers, investigations. So it's a ton of information on the site across every aspect of Indigenous issues that you can mention.
Yeah.
One of the key things when we did the design was if you're going to have a solid repository of information like that, the site really has to be easy to navigate to be able to find things.
Yeah.
And so that goes back to the organizing principles of how the site was designed. So every theme, every of those 30 themes, each one has a landing page. And that landing page it's the same structure for all 30 landing pages, for every single one. Mm-hmm. It's got a status of what it is. It's got a featured updates in terms of what's happened most recently within that event. What are the current problems within child welfare, within justice, within health, within UNDRIP, within media, within business? What's background content? And this is additional information to complement the actions and commitments that various stakeholders are taking. Right. So every single theme page has exactly the same structure to pour the content into. And same with the call to action page, which has exactly the same structure as well. Right. It's got what's the explanation of what the status is. It has, again, the featured articles. It has the actions and commitments from any one of the stakeholders for that particular call to action, as well as background content again. Right. So the way that that information is structured and made available to an easy to navigate site, as well as complemented by a search function that again gives a different way of accessing same information. If you use the search, when you type anything into the search bar of Indigenous Watchdog, it brings up a filter. And that filter has on the left all of the themes that search item is listed in. So if you type in like Jordan's Principle, it's not just going to be in child welfare. There'll be other things in education. There'll be things in language and culture. There'll be things in health that Jordan's Principle impacts. And so when you do the search, it opens up where on the site is all of the other ancillary information relating to that particular theme, right? And then it gives you a list. And you can sort it out. And there's ways of sorting it also by stakeholder. So you can go to search in child welfare, right? Search by Saskatchewan, by Manitoba, by Ontario. So each jurisdiction can find the information relative to their jurisdiction as well. I mean, it's all that, going back to your question about the status currently, according to the information at Indigenous Watchdog, 44% of the calls to action are stalled or not started right now, as of February the 1st, 2026. Right? Because every beginning of every month, there's a file that gets published on Indigenous Watchdog, which is basically what's new in Indigenous Watchdog. And it's a document that highlights anything new on the site. And these are embedded and sorted by theme. So you open up this document and it's got government commitments to truth and reconciliation, sorted by government commitments, by environment, by treaties and land claims, by anything that government commitments are making high-level commitments to. And the same thing is sorted by child welfare, by language and culture, by health, by justice, anything that's happened that month. And it's a link to the actual article on the site. Right. So it's, and going back to the site again, if someone clicks, there's a little thumbnail on the homepage of the site. And it takes that, it's just called what's new and what's the status of reconciliation as of February the 1st. And you click on that thumbnail. And that's probably the most important document on the site. And that takes you to an 8-page summary. 4 pages are all 94 calls to action. It's color-coded, so it's green is in progress, orange is stalled, red is not started, and then there's a check mark next to the ones that are completed. So there's 15 completed. I think it's 16 are not started, and 22 have stalled. So it's, so, and that gives you a visual representation of all 94 calls to action that are snapshot. And in the same document, there's another 3 pages that highlight which ones have been completed with an explanation, which ones have not started and why they haven't started, or what the rationale is. And for the ones that are stalled, why are they stalled? Right. So everything on an 8-page document gives you the summary of everything that's on the site in terms of what started, what stalled, what the issues are. Included in that, there's a graph. And that graph, you can almost call it the pulse of reconciliation. It goes back to 2019. And so it's every 6 months, going back to 2019. It's a graph, and there's about 8, like 2019, 2020, 2021. You can go back.
Is it current up to date to today, or how up to date is it?
It's up to date as well. That chart is current as of February the 1st, 2026.
Okay.
And the site itself, I mean, all the content is up. It's the current content. It's like whatever's being posted on February 18th or 17th or whatever it is in the past few days.
What's the website again?
It's indigenouswatchdog.org. And so if someone just typed in Indigenous Watchdog, they get to the site.
Okay.
As I said, it's a wealth of information.
Yeah.
Pretty well every major critical Indigenous issue that you could think of.
How is Indigenous Watchdog connected to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation?
Well, there's not really a formal connection with the National Center at all, because the National Center is the sort of the main repository and the archival history of all of the National Center, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports and activity and ongoing work around residential schools. I mean, so their primary mandate is working with the survivors, right, to ensure that their stories are archived and made available to anyone in the country that wants to have access to that level of information. One thing, the main connection that I've had with the National Center is that all of the pictures on the site are all from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And I worked with their research director at the time. This goes back to 2022, I guess, or 2021, when the site was being built. And I worked with them to collect pictures that I could put onto the site. I mean, so all of the pictures on the site come from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and all of the graphics, like the graphics on the theme pages, I mean, they all come from a collective of Indigenous students in Winnipeg that worked with me on terms of providing a pool of graphics that I could use to offer some visual relief and context onto the site as well.
To me, when I look at both the organizations, there is a connection there. You're kind of the work that they started, right?
Yeah, well, when you think about it, I mean, the National Center came out directly from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what I'm doing directly comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well.
Right.
It's just the where the National Center is focused on the survivors, right, and putting together program services and policies relating to that. My focus is more on what are the stakeholders doing about it.
Yeah.
What are they not doing about it? And following very specifically those calls to action.
Yeah.
And being an accountability watchdog, right?
Yeah, for sure.
To say this is the truth based on those 11 primary sources. So it's not like there's, I mean, it's probably some slightly subjective stuff, but not really, because it's really all of the opinions or thoughts that go onto the site. And the only place there's really sort of my personal opinions on things is in the perspectives section, which is on the site. And that's more like blog posts that I put out. Based on, again, it's based on the content. Like the National Post has published a lot of different articles, really sort of impugning the residential schools and a lot of the TRC work that's been done. And so there's a number of articles on the site in perspectives that basically gathers the information from the Indigenous Watchdog and basically puts it into a rebuttal, basically saying this is what you're saying is a crock, and this is why it's a crock, and then providing all of that sort of substantiated information. And I think that's one of the values of Indigenous Watchdog is as you build up this repository of information, it allows anyone to be able to take that information and drive forward their own reconciliation agenda. And so the mission of Indigenous Watchdog is really about informing, educating, and empowering users, right, to drive their own reconciliation agendas, whatever that may be.
Yeah. Plus, it's holding these agencies and these governments accountable, right? And I think it's an important. That's really an important part of what you do. Is
So that's the key. That's the number one thing is
yeah,
the holding stakeholders accountable.
yeah. So, who are the stakeholders?
Well, it's all level of government. So it's federal, provincial, territory, and there's 5 calls to action specific to municipalities. So the municipalities have stuff in there as well.
Yeah.
Then you've got the churches, you've got schools, colleges and universities, boards of education, business is certainly a big one. Civil servants have things directed at them as well.
Mm.
And so it's important to really, the bulk of the information that you see coming from the press is going to be primarily from the governments and business. And that's actually where you can see a shift in sort of the reconciliation narrative over the past 2 years. I mean, because now before they talked about business and reconciliation, for example, which was supposed to be guided by UNDRIP as the guiding framework to govern business relationships within Indigenous communities where they work. And that conversation has shifted over the last 2 years to now economic reconciliation, where it's all about jobs and training and things like that, and getting equity loans to buy into infrastructure projects. I mean, but that's quite a fundamental shift from from using UNDRIP as a reconciliation framework to guide business relationships with Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
Right. So it's so that has shifted that conversation. And another part of the shift is the residential school denialism, which was again in the last year or so has been becoming more pronounced and more getting more publicity around it, and sort of Indigenous identity and all of the controversies around pretendians, right? Things like that. So there's a lot of sort of counter narratives to reconciliation that are starting to sort of undermine, to me, the reconciliation initiative and what should be focused on. Yeah. And that's sort of an ongoing challenge, I think, for anyone that's involved in trying to drive reconciliation forward, is to to sort of counter that narrative that's evolving.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Ayaya songs are about our histories. Ayaya is an Inuit-owned firm that tells our stories in many languages across Canada. They are experts in publishing children's books, usually in syllabics, and they do large multi-language projects like the reports of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission. If you need help getting your stories into classrooms or homes in Cree, Inuktitut, or other Indigenous languages, check them out at ayaya.ca. That's ayaya.ca. Ayaya is a proud sponsor of the Roots and Hoots podcast.
You think, given the current state in Canada with our new government and what they're having to deal with, with the government down south, has that? Do you think any of that? With all the projects you're talking about, and a lot of it affects Indigenous lands, do you think that would have some kind of impact on some of the 94 calls to action, especially when it comes to land use and equity in some of the projects?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the like over the last 8 months on the website Indigenous Watchdog, I mean, up until then, I mean, government commitments was, I mean, there was a fair bit of content coming in. But once Canada introduced Bill C5, Ontario introduced Bill 5, BC introduced Bill 14 and Bill 15, and those are all the projects, the legislation to fast-track projects, right, in all 3 jurisdictions. Once those sort of became law, the number of articles and posts and issues and problems posted on the site went up. I think it was like 35% in terms of the overall volume of calls. And it just totally skewed everything else because there was so much resistance. And this is right across the country. Every province, every territory. There is almost, I won't say total, but there was almost unanimous resistance.
Resistance to what?
To those bills, because they threatened, like you talked about land, right? The number one threat was the threat to treaty relationships right? Because it's the treaties that define the relationship that Indigenous First Nations have to the lands. Same with the Inuit as well, right? With their not necessarily with treaty, but through the modern treaties that they have.
The land claims, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, that's the number one issue. Is of all of because the four main issues that I see is that are getting in the way of reconciliation, and that's number one, is the lack of political will to deal with the land issue, which has been ongoing for 150 years. In fact, there was a good book I just finished reading called it was by the current treaty commissioner in BC. He basically looked at the history, because BC was if you look at all the landmark court cases in Canada, I mean, the bulk of them are in BC because that's where they didn't have treaties. So it's more of a so you got like the Sokotan, you got the Haida, Haisla, you got the like all these different treaties that have been settled. Well, not settled, but certainly the court decisions have recognized and identified the Aboriginal rights and title. Right. So but everywhere across the province, the country, and you can go back 6 years to when UNDRIP first came out, right? Because the number one issue, you had 6 conservative provinces all opposed to UNDRIP when it was first introduced. They're all conservative governments, and the main issue they had was because they didn't want to relinquish control over the natural resources in the land. Right. At the end of the day, that's all it comes down to is this doctrine of discovery that goes back to the papal bulls from the 15th century.
Yeah.
Right, where they want to basically say this is our land, not your land, and we control it, and we're not going to give it up. And and that's been perpetuated. And it's and even UNDRIP, where they say that UNDRIP sort of acknowledges that the doctrine of discovery is now null and void. It's only in the preamble; it's not in the actual body of the text.
Yeah,
the preamble is not legally enforceable. Right, so they pay lip service to things. Now you've got Premier Avey in BC stating that he's going to revise UNDRIP, the legislation that they passed unanimously in the legislature. They're going to revise it because he wasn't happy with court decisions. And so he's basically saying that we're going to revise it so that the courts can't dictate what reconciliation and land claims are about. And this goes back as well to the Cowichan decision, which was like the National Post and other conservative organizations have been blowing it all out of proportion, saying this is a direct threat to property rights, fee simple property rights of non-Indigenous people across the country, anywhere in the country, which is a crock, because that's not what the court said. They basically gave the federal government and the provincial government 18 months to sort of reconcile the challenge and the disconnect and the stealing of Indigenous land from the Cowichan tribes 150 years ago. Right, and again, this book, forget the name of it now, but it's and he talks about it. Like Cowichan, they were having this discussion 120 years ago about the land that was taken from them, and everywhere in BC, it's all about land that has been taken by government to further their own economic agendas, which is all about primarily resource extraction, and so that's why there's this huge resistance to the fast tracking these resource extraction projects to deal with the threat coming from the States, which is fine. I mean, it's a legitimate threat that's coming from the States that Canada has to respond to. Mm-hmm. But what the Indigenous people are saying, the First Nations are saying, you can't address Trump's problems on our backs. You've done that for 150 years. It's not going to happen again.
Yeah.
And they're not saying we're not opposed to development, but it has to be development on our terms.
Right.
You can't just do what you want anymore. This is our land. This is our lives. This is our treaties. This is where we live. We are the ones that have to deal with the consequences. So if you're going to pass legislation to fast track a project, then you have got to consult with us and not just do a checkbox and say, okay, now we've done it. You have to have meaningful consultation with us. And if there's a problem, you have to mitigate the problem to come up with a solution that both sides can live with. That's all they're asking for, which is a perfectly reasonable ask, especially when you look at the 150 years of dispossession and disenfranchisement and marginalization that governments have leveraged over that last 150 years to grow the Canadian economy to the benefit of everybody else, except First Nations and except the Inuit and except the Métis.
Yeah. What would you say has been the biggest challenge in making progress on all the 94 calls to action?
Well, I alluded to it. I mean, I said that, like, there's a number of basic problems. The number one is the treaties and land claims, the lack of political will, right, to deal with the land issue. But if you look at the calls to action, there's 5 that deal with data, like social work, health, education, justice. They all have calls to action specific to government to gather and make available statistics about in child welfare, how many kids are in care across the country, Indigenous versus non-Indigenous. What are, like, a lot of the other issues around child welfare? I mean, give us the data around this. It hasn't even started yet, or it's been stalled. I mean, each one of those 5, I think 3 of them have not started and 2 of them have stalled.
These calls to action, why do you think they've stalled or stopped? Does it have to do anything with policy that's being developed, or?
No, I think a lot of it goes back to to me, it goes back to the primary cause, which is the lack of political will. And if you look at the primary example of that, there's 2 primary examples of that. One is the calls to action dealing with the National Council for Reconciliation. The National Council for Reconciliation, that was defined by the TRC as the fundamental governance body to track and report on how the governments are doing and stakeholders are doing in advancing reconciliation across all sectors of society. And they set up an interim board in 2018, 3 years after the TRC came out. The interim board produced their recommendations to the government, I think in 2019 or something like that. I forget the dates exactly. But the governments have not done anything with it until March of this year, when they finally passed legislation to enact the National Council of Reconciliation as a nonprofit organization, arm's length from the government, to be able to do the work of the National Council, which was to track and report through Parliament on how reconciliation is advancing in Canada. So it took them 10 years, 2015 to 2025, to get that legislation in place. And the National Council then had 18 months to operationalize the National Council into a working entity to be able to report on what's happening with truth and reconciliation. So that's one example of the lack of political will. The other political will I mentioned before was about all of these issues around governments refusing to deal with the treaties. They were just ignoring treaties at their convenience, right? Which is that's been an ongoing challenge. And even if you look at Quebec, right, they have they're trying to pass its constitution, which totally abrogates. It doesn't deal with the Aboriginal people and First Nations, like First Nations in Quebec. And you get Alberta, the Separatist Act, right, when they want to get the separation in place. Again, they're ignoring the reality that First Nations have a treaty with the Crown, not with the government of Alberta. So now you've got all these governments, BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, right, all fighting against, in that issue, the political will around land and treaty rights and Indigenous rights. Then the second one was the data, which is around the problem. And another one dealing with like other stakeholders is around colleges and universities. Some of the funding that I received about a year and a half ago was to do research to all of the schools of nursing, the schools of law, the law societies, the journalism schools, schools of social work, medical schools. How are they responding to the calls to action that they have in terms of implementing mandatory courses for students to take courses dealing with the history of residential schools, history of Aboriginal rights and treaties. So UNDRIP. So we did this research over about a year and a half. And so there's now about 150 documents on the site. There's a bunch on Call to Action 1 for the schools of social work. Call to Action 24 has a bunch for the schools of nursing and for medical schools. Call to Action 27, I think, is the law societies. Call to Action 28 has the faculties of law. And then Call to Action 86 is the schools of journalism. Mm-hmm. So all of this is on the site. And of those, there's like 100 and, what's the, one sec. There was 213 schools that were approached. 145 responded. And I think the average is just under 50% had mandatory courses for dealing with at least most of there's 5 items that were identified primarily for these courses on mandatory to be taught to students, and it's like just under 50% didn't comply, didn't have that. And you look at the schools, like you look at one of the biggest issues is that systemic racism is still very much alive and well in Canada. And based on I did a presentation based on data from 2023, 2024 and 2025. And of all of the content on the site, there was well over, I think it was 30 plus percent in child welfare, 30 plus percent in health, about 60% in justice, all had to do with systemic racism through various events and things that happened across the country. Mm-hmm. And justice, it was systemic racism in police, and systemic racism in the RCMP. Right. So there was, in 60% of all of the items that went into justice over that 2-year period, all had to do with systemic racism issues around those 3 areas. And so you have to ask yourself, so what gives? And part of that goes back to education when you have these schools that are not being compliant in terms of providing mandatory courses and training on Indigenous issues. So you have all of these professionals in social work and nursing and doctors that are going out into the field, right, without having the requisite training. I mean, that's not obviously categorically across all schools. And the site ranks, it shows all of these are the schools that are 100%. And some of the schools, definitely, there's a lot of universities and colleges that embrace reconciliation fully and have implemented either standalone courses or integrated courses across multiple courses to deliver content. But it ranges quite a lot. Mm-hmm. Some places might have like a 3-hour course, and that's it for the whole reconciliation agenda. Other places, like the University of Victoria, in the law faculty, has reconciliation courses across every single course. They have like 8 courses that are mandatory that deal with Indigenous issues.
Yeah. Sounds like to me that you should be a professor at one of these universities, or go to schools and lecture some of the schools and universities about this whole thing, 94 calls to action. Is there anything, though, that in the work that you do that gives you a good sense of satisfaction?
Well, I know that based on the feedback that I get from people that are actually using the site, I know that it does a lot of good work, and there's a lot of organizations that I've spoken to where they actually take that weekly, they basically have like a weekly meeting where they review the content that's going on to Indigenous Watchdog. And this is where they're talking about sort of their own sort of internal policy discussions or reference, the research questions that they have. Mm-hmm. So they reference the site quite a bit. And I know that there's different universities, like there's an MBA program at Wilfrid Laurier University that uses Indigenous Watchdog for case studies when they talk about different factors that impact businesses.
Yes, that must give you, a sense of satisfaction.
That's the saving grace, I think, is to know that there's concrete steps that are being taken by different individuals and organizations to make use of the data that's being gathered up, to, like I said, empower themselves to drive their own reconciliation agendas. It's I had one university professor was using it as there was like some of the contact around systemic racism in health. Yeah. Right? They were at a conference. That was the topic of discussion, was systemic racism in health. Yeah. They used a lot of the content on Indigenous Watchdog to sort of validate a lot of the points that she was making in terms of what's happening and what's not happening.
Has the Indigenous Watchdog been successful, in your opinion, in its mission? Has it achieved? Probably not quite yet, I would think, that you'd hope for.
No, I think it's. I think where it's been successful has been with within people that have been impacted by reconciliation, not so much with the stakeholders themselves. I think the governments have just not been as responsive as they could be across. And you can say that pretty well across all of the calls to action. And there's been 15 that have been complete. Some of them, and even those 15 that have been complete, 4 of them I think have caveats attached to them. And call to action 41 about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was a call to action that's considered complete,
Yeah.
but it has an asterisk because there's 231 calls to justice that still have to be tracked. And as of June of last year, there was only 2 of those that have been implemented.
Yeah.
And so even though it's checked off as complete, and even Indigenous Watchdog says, yeah, it's complete, they ticked off the box.
Yeah.
There's an asterisk next to it saying, and on the site as well, saying it's not complete because there's still these 231 calls to justice that have to be tracked. And same with the Museums Association had a call to action to develop a report upon how the museums can better respond to reconciliation. So yes, they produced the report, they submitted it to government, so that yes, they completed the call to action. But there's an asterisk to it because those recommendations still have to be followed up on. The same with the archives. Same with the call to action 80, which is the statutory holiday for the National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Because there's majority of populations that have the majority of Indigenous people have not refused to make it a statutory holiday. Right. So there's a lot of things are happening.
Yeah.
There's still a huge way to go.
Okay, one last question. What do you think needs to happen to make reconciliation a success in Canada now and let's say in 10 years?
Well, I guess the key thing is for the governments to be more responsive. And I think that the real test is going to be in the next 24 months in terms of how Mark Carney and how Bill Eby in BC and Doug Ford in Ontario, how do they engage with First Nations and the Inuit in the North, and with Métis where they are, in terms of advancing their bills for fast-tracking projects.
Yeah.
How do they address consultation and the concerns and the issues that Indigenous people have with what they're trying to do? And that's going to be the test.
That's going to be a tough one.
If they ride roughshod to just get what they want, and just throw some money at organizations, then that doesn't look very good for the long term.
Yeah.
All to do it to say, we'll give you like the legislation. To me, it just doesn't make sense that there's like the federal government and the Ontario government have set up equity loan programs so that impacted First Nations, they can take out a loan to buy equity in a project. And to me, why should they have to pay
Right.
to get a loan that they have to pay back for them to come in and take their resources? The resources on their land, they should pay them a royalty right up front and say, this is what we're going to pay you. Everything else is sort of gravy on top of that. But the fundamental question is, if it's you're coming onto our land to take resources, first of all, you have to pay for the resources. Secondly, you have to deal with the challenges that you have to address to make it a success, because we're not just going to roll over and let you come in here and do what you want. It has to be on our terms, because we are the ones that live in this territory and we are the ones that have to survive it.
You should have been a lawyer. You speak really well, and you speak really well in support of the 9-4 calls to action. I want to just ask you if you have any last closing comments you'd like to make.
Well, I mean, yeah, this is sort of a plug I'm going to make. That I did a presentation at McMaster University in December around what's the status of reconciliation, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Just basically in telling the truth about where reconciliation is at and explaining where the problems are, why there's some of these problems, and potentially what some of the solutions are. So I'm starting to do a campaign probably in the next week or so to different schools, different colleges, universities, to business as well, to organizations, about doing the same kind of presentation to them as well. So if anyone out there is looking to have a presentation done around reconciliation, I'm your guy.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinclair, for taking the time to do this with us.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciated the opportunity.
On behalf of the Legacy of Hope Foundation, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. As I said, I really appreciate this, and I hope your listeners get some value out of the discussion as well.
I'm sure they will.
Roots and Hoots is a podcast project produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation. For episode show notes, please visit the podcast description and make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. For more information about the work we do, please visit legacyofhope.ca.